Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're taking a close look at anger, aggression, and violence, particularly how these connect to impulse control disorders.
Uh-huh.
We've got quite the mix of sources for this one.
Oh,
We've
yeah.
got textbook chapters, the latest research articles, even some snippets from a medical lecture series.
Wow.
We're going deep, not just skimming the surface.
Yeah, we're not just defining terms.
Right, we're looking at what's going on in the brain, how these things actually show up in the real world, and of course,
And how do we even begin to deal with them?
exactly. I think one of the most surprising things I found while prepping for this was, well, anger itself isn't always a bad thing.
Hmm.
Our sources define anger as this strong feeling of annoyance or hostility.
But it
But
can be, well, it can be a real force for good too,
it's
right?
true. Like, think about those times you feel angry about some kind of injustice.
Oh, yeah, or when someone you care about gets hurt.
Exactly. Anger can fuel action, help you overcome fear, even inspire real change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like it gives you the energy to stand up for what's right?
Right, right, to stand up for yourself, for what you believe in. But then we get to aggression.
Yeah, that's where things get a little more complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, aggression, that's about intentionally trying to harm someone or something.
Hmm.
And that harm, it can be physical, obviously, but also verbal or even emotional, right?
So it's like that intention to cause harm is what really separates it from anger.
I think so, yeah. But even with aggression, we have to remember it's not always a bad thing,
Oh, interesting.
like self-defense, for example.
Right, protecting yourself or others.
Exactly. That's a form of aggression, but it's necessary.
Okay, so the key difference is really the intent behind it.
Yeah. Are you acting to protect, or are you intentionally trying to inflict harm?
That line can be blurry though, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Especially when you factor in mental health or substance use.
Hmm, yeah. And then there's violence, which is,
The most extreme form of aggression, yeah.
yeah, it results in serious physical harm. And our sources really emphasize this violence is a major public health issue with huge consequences.
For everyone involved, individuals, families, communities.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, like, what's happening in our brains when these powerful emotions and behaviors take over?
That's what I was thinking.
I mean, it's this really intricate interplay of neurochemicals and hormones.
Wow.
You've got dopamine, serotonin, GABA, all these neurotransmitters that regulate mood, behavior, impulsivity.
Like a delicate dance, right?
Exactly, yeah. And if one of those partners steps out of line,
The whole routine's thrown off.
uh-huh. For example, our sources talk about how in schizophrenia, an excess of dopamine's been linked to aggression.
Oh, wow.
But then you've got low serotonin levels, which are often seen in folks prone to impulsive violence, even suicide.
So it's not just one chemical, it's the balance, the way they all interact.
Yeah, the whole picture.
What about hormones then? I know testosterone is often blamed for aggression.
Yeah, especially in men. It does play a role, definitely, but it's not the whole story.
Oh, really?
It's interesting, studies have actually shown that testosterone treatments in women can also increase aggression,
Hmm.
which suggests, that hormones like testosterone interact with those other brain chemicals we were talking about to really influence behavior.
So it's more complicated than just saying, oh, testosterone makes you aggressive.
Right, right. And we can't forget about the other hormones either, like glucocorticoids.
Glucocorticoids, those are the stress hormones,
Right?
right?
Uh-huh. And both low and high levels of those have been linked to aggression.
Oh, interesting. So how does that work?
Well, like chronic stress, for example,
Yeah.
that can lead to lower glucocorticoid levels.
Okay.
And that's been associated with more impulsive aggression.
That makes sense.
But then on the flip side, you've got medications like dexamethasone.
Oh, dexamethasone, that's a pretty common one.
Yeah, it's a type of corticosteroid, and that actually elevates those glucocorticoid levels.
Okay.
And while it can trigger aggression as a side effect too,
Wow, so even medications designed to help can sometimes have these unintended consequences.
it's a complex system. And it really highlights how important it is to consider all these factors when prescribing any kind of medication.
Yeah, especially those that affect the brain's chemistry.
Absolutely.
This is actually a good segue into what I wanted to talk about next, which is, well, the fact that some medications can actually have aggression or violence listed as a potential side effect.
Yeah, that's a bit unsettling.
And we're not talking about some obscure drugs here. These are medications that are prescribed pretty commonly.
You're right. For all sorts of conditions.
Like, for instance, some antidepressants.
Yeah, particularly in kids and teens, those have been linked to an increased risk of suicidal thoughts, even homicidal.
And behaviors, right?
Uh-huh. And even medications for Parkinson's disease, like carbidopa-levodopa,
Oh, okay.
those work by increasing dopamine levels in the brain, remember?
Right.
Well, in some patients, that can actually lead to aggression, even paranoia.
It's like a delicate balancing act, right?
Definitely.
These medications can be so helpful for some people, but it's crucial to be aware of those potential downsides too.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, we have to talk about substances like alcohol and drugs. I mean, it's no secret that alcohol can fuel aggression.
The classic drunken brawl, right?
Exactly.
Alcohol, it lowers inhibitions, makes people more impulsive.
It's like it flips a switch in the brain.
Yeah, and people just don't think about consequences the same way.
But it's not just alcohol, right?
No. Hallucinogens, too, like ecstasy and LSD, those can also lead to violence.
I can see that. I mean, those drugs can really create these terrifying experiences.
Yeah, disorienting, confusing, people might lash out in fear.
Makes sense.
Then you've got PCP, which
Oh, PCP.
that one can make people feel super strong, powerful,
And
but
also highly aggressive.
yeah, and even violent. There have been cases where PCP use has been linked to, well, to homicides.
Yeah, it's almost like the drug gives them this feeling of invincibility, but takes away their restraint at the same time.
That's a good way to put it.
And we can't forget about anabolic steroids either.
The ones used for building muscle.
Yeah, those. They can trigger what some people call roid rage.
Yeah, aggressive outbursts.
It's clear that substance use plays a big role in this whole picture.
A huge role. It's like adding fuel to the fire, literally.
So we've talked about these general concepts of anger, aggression, violence, but now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about specific types of violence.
Okay.
Our sources focus on three main areas: child abuse, intimate partner violence, and elder abuse.
These are tough topics, often hidden from view.
Yeah, they are. The CDC defines domestic violence as physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, or even psychological aggression by a current or former intimate partner.
So it's not just physical harm, it's about one person exerting power and control over another.
Through a pattern of abuse.
Yeah, and it's often cyclical.
Our sources talk about how kids who grow up witnessing domestic violence are more likely to become victims or perpetrators of violence themselves.
It's like this terrible cycle that repeats.
A heartbreaking reality, and it makes it even more urgent to find ways to break that cycle.
Right, to intervene early, create a culture of respect and healthy relationships.
Now, when it comes to child abuse specifically,
We're talking about any intentional act or even failure to act by a parent or caregiver that causes harm or puts a child at risk.
right, and it's not always obvious. The signs can be subtle.
Especially with infants. You have to be really vigilant for any unexplained injuries.
Especially to the head, neck, or torso.
Yeah.
With older kids, the signs might be more behavioral.
Like becoming withdrawn or more aggressive, unexplained bruises, changes in school performance.
It's about trusting your gut, right? If something feels off.
Yeah, if something just doesn't seem right, always better to err on the side of caution.
When it comes to intimate partner violence,
Mm.
those injuries are often more visible.
Sadly, yeah.
Our sources mention the head, neck, and face as the most common areas. And again, it's not just physical.
Right. Emotional abuse, psychological, financial control, that all falls under this umbrella.
One detail that really stuck with me was the mention of defensive injuries on the forearms and hands.
Oh, yeah, that's chilling.
And-
Imagine having to shield yourself from blows constantly.
And we can't forget, this isn't limited to heterosexual relationships either. Same-sex partner violence is just as prevalent.
Absolutely. It's just often less talked about.
Right. And then we have elder abuse, which
Or
is
any harm or risk of harm to an older adult by someone they trust.
someone they should be able to rely on.
Yeah, and it can take so many forms. Physical, emotional, financial, neglect.
It's hard to even imagine someone taking advantage of a vulnerable elder like that.
But it happens far too often.
And just like child abuse, the signs can be subtle.
Bruising, weight loss, behavioral changes, anything unusual with their finances, those are all things to watch for.
So we've talked about this devastating impact of violence, and it's clear it's a complex issue. But what about impulse control disorders? How do those fit into all of this?
Well, impulse control disorders, or ICDs, they're mental health conditions where someone can't resist urges or impulses that could be harmful.
To themselves or to others?
Right. It's like there's this battle going on in their brain, and those impulsive urges just keep winning.
And they can manifest in all sorts of ways, depending on the specific type of ICD, right?
Exactly.
Our sources focus mainly on three: conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and pyromania.
Yeah, those tend to have a pretty significant impact on someone's life, their relationships.
So conduct disorder, that sounds pretty serious.
It is. CD, it's characterized by this persistent pattern of violating societal norms and the rights of others.
Okay, so it's more than just typical teenage rebellion.
Yeah, much more. We're talking about aggression, cruelty to animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness, theft, serious violations of rules.
Some of the examples our sources give are pretty intense, like bullying, forcing others into sexual activity.
Setting fires, breaking into homes or cars. This isn't just kids being kids.
It's a serious disorder with long-term consequences.
Right. And it's important to note that CD can have different ages of onset.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, childhood onset, that's before age 10, is more common in males, and it often involves a lot of physical aggression.
Okay.
But then you have adolescent onset starting in the teenage years, which might be less physically aggressive, but it can still have really serious consequences.
So what happens to these kids as they get older?
Well, not everyone with CD goes on to develop antisocial personality disorder, but
But it's a risk factor.
it is, yeah.
That's concerning. So can anything be done to help these kids?
Well, the good news is there are treatments that can help. It's usually a multimodal approach,
Meaning,
targeting both the individual and their environment.
it's not just about changing the child's behavior, it's about the whole context.
Exactly. One common approach is parent management training, where
Okay.
parents learn to set those consistent limits, reward positive behaviors, encourage pro-social skills,
So it's about giving parents the tools to manage their child's behavior.
and create a more structured, nurturing environment at home.
Okay, I like that.
Another effective approach is multisystemic therapy.
Multisystemic therapy. What is that exactly?
It's a pretty intensive family and community-based treatment program.
Okay.
It addresses all those multiple factors contributing to a child's delinquent behavior, working with the child, their family, school, even their peers.
So it's like a whole network of support.
Yeah, everyone working together to create accountability.
Makes sense. And what about individual therapy for the child?
Oh, that can be incredibly beneficial too.
Okay.
Helping them develop problem-solving skills, improve their emotional regulation, build healthier relationships, and learn to resist those negative peer influences.
It's a lot to tackle.
It is, but it can be done.
Now, what about medication? Is that ever used for conduct disorder?
It might be considered, yeah, but usually to address co-occurring conditions
Right.
like ADHD, depression, or anxiety. Those can make the symptoms of CD even worse.
So it's about treating the whole person, not just the one label.
Exactly. Now let's move on to oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD.
ODD, that one seems like it could be easily misunderstood. I mean, a lot of kids are defiant and argumentative. How is this different?
It's really about the severity, how often it happens, and how persistent it is.
Okay.
With ODD, the defiance is way more excessive, it's disruptive, and it happens everywhere, not just at home. They're not just testing boundaries, they're actively challenging authority, arguing constantly, refusing to follow rules.
So their defiance is almost on overdrive.
You could say that, and it's really important to intervene early
Why?
because ODD can have a huge impact on a child's development, socially, emotionally, even academically.
Our sources actually mentioned that about a third of kids with ODD will eventually develop conduct disorder.
That's right. Early identification and treatment are key.
So treatment for ODD, is it similar to what we talked about for conduct disorder?
There are definitely some overlaps.
Like a...
Parent training is still a big part of it.
Okay, so giving parents the tools to manage that defiant behavior.
Exactly, and creating that more positive home environment. And individual therapy can be super helpful too.
In what way?
You know, teaching coping skills, anger management, ways to communicate better, improve problem solving.
Makes sense. And what about medication? Is that ever used for ODD?
It might be if there are other mental health conditions going on, like ADHD, anxiety, mood disorders.
Those could be fueling the defiance and irritability.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so the last ICD we're going to cover today is pyromania. This one seems particularly, I don't know, concerning.
It is. It's characterized by this irresistible urge to set fires.
So it's not about vandalism or revenge, it's about the fire itself.
Yeah, the act of setting it. People with pyromania, they often feel this tension, this arousal before setting a fire. And then after, they feel relief, even pleasure.
Wow, that's a powerful and dangerous combination. Is it difficult to treat?
It is. There's not a ton of research on pyromania, unfortunately.
But there are some approaches that have shown promise.
Right. Yeah, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT,
Okay.
It's often used to help people with pyromania really understand those thoughts and behaviors that are contributing to the fire setting.
So, like, what triggers them, how to cope with the urges, find healthier ways to manage those impulses.
Exactly. And in some cases, medication might also be used if there are any underlying mental health conditions playing a role.
It's all about getting a complete picture of what's going on.
Yeah, and addressing all the different pieces.
So we've covered a lot of ground today, from the biology of anger and aggression to the complexities of these impulse control disorders.
And it's clear there are no easy answers here.
It's multifaceted,
Yeah.
for sure. But one thing that stood out to me was just how much shame and stigma surrounds these issues.
Yeah, that's a big problem. It makes it even harder for people to reach out for help.
We need to create a more understanding environment where people feel safe talking about these things.
Absolutely. And while we focused a lot on the challenges, I think it's important to remember that there's always hope.
I agree.
With early intervention, the right treatment, ongoing support, individuals can learn to manage their impulses and lead fulfilling lives.
It's not about labeling people, it's about supporting them, helping them heal and thrive. So what's next on our deep dive? We've talked about causes, we've talked about how these issues manifest, but what about the treatments? What can actually be done to help people regain control and live healthier, safer lives?
That's a great question, and we're going to dive into that right after a quick break. Stay with us.
Before the break, we were talking about how important it is to really understand what's at the root of anger, aggression, and those impulse control problems. But, just knowing the why isn't enough, is it?
You're right, it's just the first step. The real question is, how do we help people who are actually struggling with these issues?
So it sounds like a good assessment is key, right?
Yeah.
We need to know, are we talking about aggression stemming from, I don't know, a mental health condition, substance abuse,
Right.
past trauma, or some combination?
Exactly. It's like solving a puzzle. You have to figure out how all those pieces fit together to see the whole picture.
And once you have that picture, that's when you can start tailoring a treatment plan.
Uh,
Okay, so what are some of those go-to approaches? I know counseling, therapy, those come up a lot.
yeah, those are definitely cornerstones of treatment. Like individual therapy can give people that safe space to really explore their emotions, understand their triggers, and learn how to cope. It's about, recognizing those early warning signs and finding healthier ways to express those feelings.
It's like building a toolkit for managing emotions.
Exactly. And group therapy can be incredibly powerful too.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it helps people realize they're not alone in this, and it gives them a supportive environment to, actually practice those new skills.
And learn from others who've been there too.
Yeah, there's that shared understanding, the sense of community, which can be so healing.
Now, what about anger management classes? I've heard those can be helpful, especially for people who have trouble controlling their temper.
They can be very effective. They teach people how to identify their triggers, develop coping mechanisms, communicate more assertively, and it's a structured environment so they can practice those skills and get feedback.
So it's not just about, like, venting anger or suppressing it. It's about learning to channel it in a healthier way.
Exactly. Now, sometimes medication might also be part of the treatment plan,
Okay.
especially if the aggression is tied to a mental health condition like depression, anxiety, or bipolar disorder.
Right, because earlier we talked about how some medications can actually cause aggression as a side effect. So it seems like finding the right medication or even the right combination is really important.
It is, and it requires close collaboration with a healthcare professional who can monitor the effects and make adjustments as needed.
Makes sense. So what are some of those medications that might be used to address aggression linked to those mental health conditions?
Well, antidepressants, like Prozac, for example,
Okay.
those are sometimes prescribed to regulate mood, reduce impulsivity. And then you've got benzodiazepines like Klonopin, which can help manage anxiety and agitation, which can sometimes fuel that aggression. And for people with bipolar disorder, mood stabilizers like lithium can be really effective in preventing those extreme mood swings and reducing the risk of aggressive outbursts.
It's not just about throwing pills at the problem. It's about really understanding the underlying issue.
And finding the right medication at the right dose to address that specific issue. And even then, it's just one piece of the puzzle. It should always be combined with therapy and other supportive measures.
Now, what about those impulse control disorders we discussed? Are the treatments similar?
There are some similarities, but each disorder requires a pretty specific approach.
Let's start with conduct disorder then. What are some of the key strategies for helping kids with CD?
Well, like we mentioned before, family-based therapy is often crucial. Things like parent management training. It helps parents create that structured and supportive environment, learn how to discipline effectively, strengthen their relationship with their child.
So it's about empowering parents, not blaming them.
Exactly. And for adolescents with CD, multisystemic therapy can be really effective. It's that more holistic approach, bringing in the family, school, community, even the child's peers.
Like creating a whole safety net.
Right, everyone working together to help the young person make better choices and avoid falling into those patterns of destructive behavior. And of course, individual therapy for the child can also be helpful, teaching them coping skills, anger management techniques, improving communication, and how to solve problems more effectively.
So many layers to it.
Yeah.
What about oppositional defiant disorder then? How is that typically treated?
The approach is similar to conduct disorder, actually. Parent training is still key, helping parents manage that defiant behavior, creating that more positive home environment. And individual therapy can be beneficial too, focusing on those coping skills, anger management, and building better communication and social skills.
And just like with CD, medication might be considered if there are other mental health issues playing a role.
Exactly.
Okay, now pyromania, that one seems particularly challenging to treat.
It is. It's a complex disorder, and there's still so much we don't know about it.
But there are some promising approaches, right?
Yeah, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
Okay.
It's often used to help people with pyromania really get to the root of their triggers, learn how to cope, find healthier ways to manage those impulses. It's about breaking that cycle of tension, fire setting, and then relief.
It sounds like a lot of hard work.
It is, for both the therapist and the individual, and there's no quick fix. Treatment for pyromania often requires a long-term commitment, ongoing support.
It's about giving them the tools and the support they need to really change their lives.
Exactly. And one last point I want to emphasize is the importance of early intervention. The sooner we can identify and address these issues, the better the chances of a positive outcome.
Like catching it before it spirals out of control.
Exactly. And that's why education and awareness are so important. The more we understand about these issues, the better equipped we are to recognize those warning signs and get help.
Okay, so we talked about causes, manifestations, treatments. But what about prevention? Is there anything we can do to, I don't know, proactively address these issues and stop them from developing in the first place?
That's a great question, and it's incredibly important. We can't eliminate these challenges entirely, but we can definitely take steps to reduce their likelihood and promote a more, well, peaceful and supportive environment.
What would some of those steps look like?
Well, it starts with fostering healthy emotional development in kids, teaching them about their emotions, giving them tools to manage anger and frustration, modeling healthy communication.
It's like equipping them with all the skills they need to handle those big feelings.
Exactly. And it's not just about teaching kids, it's about creating a culture where it's okay to talk about emotions, to ask for help. We need to break down that stigma around mental health and create a more supportive environment.
We need to shift away from that tough it out mentality and embrace vulnerability, right?
Absolutely. And speaking of creating a supportive environment, another key part of prevention is addressing those societal factors that contribute to violence in the first place.
Things like poverty, inequality, exposure to violence, the things that create fertile ground for aggression and despair.
Exactly. These are complex issues, but we can't just ignore them.
Yeah.
If we want to see real change, we have to get to the root of the problem.
It's like tending a garden. You can't just focus on the leaves. You have to nurture the soil, create the right conditions for growth.
Well said. And just like tending a garden, preventing violence takes time, commitment, and collaboration. It involves individuals, families, communities, policymakers, everyone working together to create a safer, more just world.
It's a shared responsibility, not about pointing fingers or placing blame.
Right, we all have a role to play, and I think that's a powerful message to carry with us as we move towards wrapping up this deep dive.
Absolutely. We've covered so much today, and I know it can feel overwhelming. So let's take a breath, gather our thoughts, and when we come back, we'll wrap up this deep dive with some final takeaways and reflections.
And we're back! Whew. I don't know about you, but I feel like we've really been through a lot today, exploring all those different aspects of anger, aggression, and, those impulse control disorders.
It has been quite the deep dive. We went from those brain chemicals to, well, the really tough stuff like abuse and then all those different ways to treat and help people.
And it's been heavy at times, for sure, but I think what really sticks with me is how all these issues are just so connected to just being human, You can't just pretend they don't exist. Right. I mean, Understanding is always the first step towards making things better. And I think a lot of people, they have this idea that anger, aggression, those are things we just need to get rid of completely. But we saw that, they can be forces for good too, if they're used the right way.
It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? But obviously there's a line. When anger turns into that uncontrolled aggression or violence, that's when it gets really dangerous.
Yeah, and I think that's where the real takeaway lies, right? It's about awareness, recognizing those warning signs, knowing when to get help, and understanding that there are effective treatments out there.
So let's do a quick recap for our listeners just to tie it all together. We started with defining anger, aggression, violence, and you actually surprised me by saying that anger isn't always bad.
Right, think of it like a type of energy that can be, channeled into positive change. But then we have to understand that line between anger and aggression, where the intention shifts from expressing yourself to actually wanting to cause harm.
And then, of course, violence takes that harm to a whole new level with often, well, devastating consequences. And we talked about the biology of it all, too, that whole dance of dopamine, serotonin, GABA, testosterone, those glucocorticoids, the stress hormones. It's amazing how much is going on in our brains.
It is fascinating. And what we learned from all that is that it's not as easy as saying, oh, this chemical makes you angry. It's really about, the way those chemicals interact, imbalances, vulnerabilities that can change how we react to things.
And then there's medication, too. It was kind of eye-opening to see how even those common medications, like those corticosteroids for inflammation, can sometimes lead to aggression as a side effect.
Yeah.
And then there's substance use, which is, well, a whole other layer. Alcohol, drugs, steroids, those can really make those aggressive tendencies much worse.
Yeah, it's like they take away those inhibitions, make it harder to think clearly, and that's when things can escalate so quickly.
And then we talked about those really difficult topics: child abuse, intimate partner violence, elder abuse. Learning about how abuse can become this cycle that repeats through generations was really hard to hear.
Yeah, it's a tough reality, but if we want to break those cycles, we have to understand them. Early intervention, providing support for victims, and really addressing those societal factors that contribute to violence, those are all key.
We also spent some time in the world of impulse control disorders, talking about conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, pyromania. I think it was really impactful to learn about the challenges people with those disorders face and how important it is to create those individualized treatment plans.
What I found really interesting was that in many cases, these are people who are, they're trying to communicate their needs, but they're doing it through those disruptive behaviors. So it's about seeing past the behavior itself and trying to understand what's going on underneath those unmet needs.
It's about recognizing their humanity,
Yeah.
right? Not just labeling them as, I don't know, problem kids.
Exactly. And lastly, we talked about prevention. We talked about teaching kids emotional intelligence, building those supportive communities, tackling those big societal issues like poverty and inequality that can fuel so much violence.
It's like we had this roadmap now, not just for dealing with the aftermath, but for actually creating a world where anger and aggression can be turned into something positive and where violence isn't the go-to solution anymore.
It's both a challenge and an opportunity, I think.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think it's about empowerment. By learning about these issues, you're not just gaining information, you're gaining the ability to really make a difference. You can recognize the signs, know when to get help, speak up for change, and be a voice of compassion and understanding.
That's so well said. We've covered a lot today, and it can feel like a lot to process. But remember, you don't need to have all the answers right away. Just stay curious, stay informed, keep the conversation going.
Yeah, and don't forget the power of those small acts of kindness, those little moments of compassion. They can have such a big impact.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into anger, aggression, and violence.
Mhm.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.